The sound of tearing metal. Wind screaming. A man's desperate breath. At first, there was nothing but sky. A deep, endless blue. Calm, almost beautiful. And then it shattered. It happened in a flash, a streak of silver fire cutting through the air, and the world exploded around him. The roar of the engines turned into chaos. The steady rhythm of flight replaced by screams, tearing metal, and the deafening thunder of flak shells bursting through the clouds. Eugene Moran didn't even have time to think. He felt the force before he heard it. A violent punch that ripped through the tail of his B-17 and threw him backward with brutal, bone-breaking speed. And then silence. The kind of silence that follows only after something has been destroyed. The rest of the aircraft, the cockpit, the fuselage, the wings was gone. All that remained was the tail section, spinning wildly through the air like a leaf caught in a storm. And inside that broken metal shell, Gene was still alive. He tried to reach for his intercom, but his headset was gone. His arms didn't respond. A sharp pain shot through his shoulders, both of them dislocated, maybe broken. Blood filled his mouth, warm and metallic. His vision blurred, the world twisting and tumbling around him. Below, the clouds tore open, revealing the green and gray of occupied France far below. The fields looked so peaceful from up here, like a painting. It was almost impossible to believe that a war was being fought down there. Gene realized he was falling. Not in free fall, but trapped inside the remains of the bomber's tail, still spinning violently, losing altitude every second. The air screamed through the holes in the fuselage. Every gust of wind sounded like the howl of a ghost. He thought of the crew. Langley, the pilot, calm, steady, always the last to give up hope. Orison, the navigator, who used to hum jazz tunes over the intercom to steady his nerves. And the bombardier, Curtis, who kept a photo of his wife tucked inside his flight jacket, always saying, "We're all coming home, boys." All of us. Were they still alive? Had anyone else made it out before the explosion? He wanted to look back, to see, to know, but the pain was too much. The G-force pressed him against the metal wall of his turret. Every breath felt like fire. He could barely keep his eyes open. Somewhere, far off, another plane was burning. A column of black smoke curled into the sky. He thought he saw parachutes, white dots drifting in the wind, but he couldn't tell if they were men or just fragments of torn canvas. And then came the realization that froze his heart. He had no parachute. It was gone, ripped away in the blast, just like the rest of the ship. There was no plan, no way out, no miracle waiting at the bottom of this fall. Only gravity and time. His mind began to drift. Memories flickered. His childhood in Pennsylvania, the small movie theater where he saw his first airplane on screen, the day he enlisted, proud and naive, believing this war would be over by Christmas. Now Christmas was weeks away, and he was falling through the sky. He could feel the air growing warmer as the tail dropped lower. The spin slowed, a sign that the structure was collapsing, breaking apart in midair. For a brief moment, it almost felt peaceful. The clouds above, the earth below, the light shimmering across what was left of the bomber. And then something strange happened. Through the haze of pain and smoke, Gene felt a calm he couldn't explain. It wasn't surrender, not yet. It was something else, acceptance, maybe. The quiet understanding that he had done everything he could, that whatever came next was beyond his control. He closed his eyes. The wind softened. The sound faded. He saw nothing but white light, bright, endless, consuming. And just as everything went still, a thought crossed his mind. Quiet, fragile, almost a whisper. Maybe this isn't the end. Moments later, the tail hit the ground. No man should have survived that fall. But somehow one did. And this is his story. Cue distant hum of engines. Fade into the sound of 300 bombers cutting through the sky. Hours before the fall, before the blood and the fire, the morning sky over England had been calm. Inside the airbase at Thorpe Abbotts, the men of the 100th Bomb Group prepared for what they thought would be another routine mission. But there was no such thing as routine anymore. Not in late 1943. The Allies had begun a relentless campaign, striking at the very heart of Germany's industrial power. Bremen, a city of steel, ships, and smoke. Its factories churned out the submarines that prowled the Atlantic, the engines that powered the Luftwaffe, the iron that fed the Reich's war machine. And so, on November 29th, more than 300 flying fortresses were sent to erase it from the map. 300 machines of war, each one carrying 10 men, 10 lives, bound together by aluminum, courage, and luck. Among them was a B-17 they called Rikki, Tikki, Tavi, a name that felt almost playful, but war doesn't play. At her controls sat First Lieutenant Linwood Langley, just 21 years old, barely old enough to rent a car today, yet responsible for 9 souls and 30,000 pounds of explosives. Behind him, the crew moved with silent precision. Navigator Jesse Orison traced the route over the North Sea. Bombardier Donald Curtis ran his checks one last time. And in the tail, far from everyone else, Eugene Moran settled into his small, frozen metal cage, the loneliest seat in the sky. He could feel the vibration of the engines through his boots, the cold biting at his face through the thin glass of his turret. Out there, beyond the frost-covered window, the formation stretched into the distance like a city of wings, endless, glimmering in the pale winter sun. For a brief moment, there was beauty in it all, the rhythmic pulse of propellers, the silver lines cutting across the sky, a feeling, fleeting, fragile, that maybe they'd make it home again. But every man in that sky knew what waited ahead, because Bremen was one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe, and the Luftwaffe was waiting. As they neared the German coast, tension spread through the intercom, a static hum of fear masked by procedure. Everyone scanning the sky, searching for that first glimpse of the enemy. And then it came, that single, chilling call no airman ever forgets. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. The fight for Bremen had begun. Radio chatter crackles through static. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. At first, the horizon looked clear, only a thin gray line separating sea from sky. But as the Rikki, Tikki, Tavi crossed into German airspace, the air began to change. The clouds grew darker, the cold sharper, and far ahead, small black dots began to rise from the horizon like insects lifting from the edge of the world. Those weren't clouds. They were fighters. The Luftwaffe had arrived. Within seconds, the radio came alive. Overlapping voices, clipped commands, the rising pitch of fear hiding behind military calm. All across the formation, the bombers tightened up, engines roaring in sync, a flying fortress of men and metal stretching for miles. From his lonely post in the tail, Gene could see it all. Dozens of silver aircraft gliding through the air, each one shimmering like a mirror of sunlight. It was beautiful, and it was about to become hell. Then came the flak. The first shells exploded far below, dark blossoms of smoke and steel tearing open the sky. Each burst was closer than the last, the shock waves rocking the bomber, peppering the fuselage with fragments of shrapnel. The men didn't speak. They didn't need to. Every vibration, every impact was understood. One hit meant death. Gene scanned the sky, his gloved hands gripping the twin handles of his .50 caliber machine guns. The turret moved in slow, mechanical arcs. Left, right, up, down. The intercom crackled. Bandits at 10 o'clock. 200 out. And then he saw them, black-nosed Messerschmitts diving from the sun, their wings flashing like blades. The first pass came fast. Tracer fire streaked across the formation, red lines slicing through the air. One of the bombers to their left took a direct hit. The right wing snapped off like a matchstick. The plane spiraled downward, trailing smoke and flame, spinning toward the earth in slow, dreadful silence. No parachutes opened. Gene squeezed the triggers. His guns roared to life, deafening, furious, spitting fire into the endless blue. The smell of cordite filled the turret, choking and sharp. The recoil rattled his bones, but he didn't stop. He aimed where the fighters would be, not where they were, a deadly dance of instinct and timing. For a brief second, he thought he saw one of the Messerschmitts burst into flame. But there was no time to confirm. Another was already diving straight for them. Bullets tore through the fuselage. He heard the metallic thud of rounds slamming into the plane's armor. Glass shattered above him. Something hot grazed his neck. A fragment of steel, maybe, or a piece of his own turret. Tail hit. Tail hit, he shouted into the intercom. No response. Only static. He looked forward, but from his position, all he could see was smoke. Thick, black, oily smoke pouring from the left engine. The bomber was still holding formation, somehow, but the gap was widening. Langley was trying to keep them level, but the controls were sluggish. They were losing altitude. The Germans circled back for another run. This time, they came head-on. A maneuver so suicidal, so terrifying, that only the most fearless or desperate pilots attempted it. Dozens of them, in perfect formation, flew straight through the wall of flak toward the bombers. Eugene watched as the lead fighter opened fire, bright streaks of tracer rounds slicing through the sky, smashing into the nose of the Rikki, Tikki Tavi. He heard the muffled screams of his crewmates through the intercom, a mix of confusion, pain, and orders. Navigator hit. Bombardier down. Hold her steady. Hold her. Then nothing. The intercom went dead. He was alone. The plane lurched hard to the right, throwing him against the side of the turret. Smoke filled the cabin. Flames licked across the wing. Through the chaos, he could see the bomb bay doors open, the last act of a doomed mission. Langley was still alive, still fighting. Even as the plane burned, he had released the bombs, completing the mission against all odds. The payload fell, vanishing into the haze below toward Bremen's industrial heart. And for a moment, the sky glowed orange. But then came the final hit. A shell tore through the midsection of the aircraft, ripping it in half. The nose disappeared in an instant, a flash of fire and smoke. The cockpit, the wings, the fuselage, all gone. And Eugene, locked in the tail turret, felt the world spin violently around him. He was no longer flying. He was falling. Again. Only this time, he knew it. The sky was no longer sky. It was a storm of smoke and metal, a spinning, screaming void. When the Rikki Tikki Tavi tore apart, Eugene Moran felt the world come undone. One moment, he was part of a flying fortress, a machine of power, noise, and purpose. The next, he was trapped inside a fragment of it, tumbling through the air like a falling coffin. The tail section was spinning violently, its twisted aluminum creaking under unbearable stress. Eugene's harness pinned him to his seat, his body crushed by centrifugal force. Every bone felt like it might snap. Every breath was a fight. Blood poured into his eyes from a cut above his brow. His vision blurred, red and white, the color of chaos. He couldn't move his arms. The pain was like knives buried in his shoulders. But instinct, that ancient human instinct to live, refused to die. He tried to reach for his parachute, then remembered. It was gone, shot to pieces. There was another one, near the tail wheel, just a few feet away. But in this mad spin, those few feet might as well have been miles. He gritted his teeth and started to crawl. Each inch was agony. The tail groaned, threatening to tear apart completely. Wind screamed through the holes in the fuselage, turning the wreck into a shrieking metal flute. He pulled himself closer. Pain burned through his ribs, broken. His arms broken. But still he moved. Still he crawled. And then, through the shattered metal, he saw it. The open sky. For a moment, it looked like light at the end of a tunnel. Hope! He reached the parachute. His fingers trembled, slick with blood. He tried to clip it on, but his arms wouldn't work. The bones had snapped clean. He screamed, a deep, guttural sound that the rushing wind swallowed whole. The tail spun faster. The horizon and the earth merged into a single, spinning blur. Eugene's consciousness began to fade. The edges of the world dimmed. And then, the final scream of metal. The tail struck the trees. The impact was violent, almost biblical. Branches exploded. Aluminum folded like paper. And somehow, impossibly, Eugene survived. He lay on the forest floor. The remains of the tail section tangled above him like a broken cage. He could barely breathe. The air reeked of oil and blood. Somewhere nearby, leaves crackled in small fires. He reached up, touching his head, and felt the horror of it. There was a crack in his skull, so deep, he could feel the softness of the flesh beneath. But even then, he didn't pass out. He couldn't. Not yet. He rolled onto his side and began to crawl again, dragging himself away from the wreckage. Every movement sent waves of fire through his shattered body. And yet, something inside him whispered, "Keep moving. Don't stop. Not here." The forest was quiet now, eerily quiet. Only the distant echo of gunfire remained, far above, where the battle still raged. Then faintly voices, harsh, distant voices. He froze. Were they German soldiers? Or civilians out for vengeance against downed airmen? But as they came closer, he recognized the language. French. Relief washed through him. Then fear again. Would they help him? Or turn him in? He didn't have the strength to wonder for long. Moments later, rough hands lifted him from the ground. The pain was unbearable. He screamed, but the sound came out as a whisper. They carried him away, through the forest, through the smoke. And that was the last Eugene Moran saw of Rikki, Tikki, Tavi. A mighty fortress reduced to ashes in the heart of a war that devoured everything. He would wake again, in a camp hospital run by prisoners, with a metal plate in his skull, and memories that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Sound of engines screaming, shells whistling past, the faint but constant rattle of flak. No sooner had the fortress breathed a sigh of relief than the sky erupted again. The first wave had been only a prelude, a warning shot. The Luftwaffe was relentless. Bandits! They're back! A voice crackled through the intercom. Panic threaded through every syllable. From above, a second swarm of German fighters dived like predators. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s tore through the thin air, engines screaming in furious harmony with their machine guns. The sky became a tapestry of tracer fire, red, green, white, stitching deadly lines through the clouds. Every streak a potential death sentence. Eugene's twin .50 caliber Browning guns spat fire into the chaos. Each pull of the trigger was a prayer. Each burst of brass raining down around him was a reminder. The sky was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard in motion. He swung the tail section violently, tracking an FW-190 as it came screaming past. His fingers cramped on the triggers, sweat and blood blurring the edges of his vision. 3 o'clock hot, Eugene shouted, but the chaos swallowed his voice. Explosions ripped through the air. One bomber ahead twisted like a ribbon in the wind and disappeared in a ball of fire. Another disintegrated, its fuselage raining debris over the fields below. The Rikki, Tikki, Tavi shook violently with each impact. Holes in the fuselage turned into gaping wounds. Hydraulic lines hissed, fuel tanks leaked, and the smell of scorched metal filled the cabin. Eugene glanced down. Pee-wee Provost, his closest friend in the ball turret, shouted over the roar, voice almost lost. "M.O. He's coming right up our ass." The words hit him like a hammer. Eugene fired back instinctively, hitting a Focke-Wulf square in the cockpit. Smoke trailed behind it. A brief victory in the endless storm of death. Victory was fleeting. Another burst of cannon fire tore into the Rikki, Tikki, Tavi. Wings shuddered. The tail wobbled ominously. The fortress, once a symbol of impenetrable power, now felt fragile, a toy in the hands of fate. Langley's voice came over the intercom, tense, but still holding a semblance of command. "Status report." Eugene coughed blood into the intercom. "We're taking hits going down." Alarms blared. Smoke filled the tail. The fortress had begun to drift. Alone, outside the protective swarm, every German pilot now had a single target, their kill. The Rikki, Tikki, Tavi was now prey. Alone in a sky of death, the crew clung to life with fingers scraped raw and hearts hammering against ribs that felt like they would burst. The second wave had not just found them. It had marked them. The engines groaned under the punishment. Every shudder of the fuselage seemed to whisper, "This is the end." Eugene looked around. Faces pale, eyes wide. Men muttered prayers, whispered names, or stared straight into the void. And still, somehow, Gene's hand stayed on the triggers, firing into the chaos, defiance against the impossible. For those few terrifying minutes, the Rikki Tikki Tavi was not a bomber. It was a crucible, and only those who endured it would see another sunrise. The roar of engines had faded. The formation that once shielded them was gone. The sky stretched endlessly, a cruel expanse of blue and cloud. The Rikki Tikki Tavi drifted alone, wounded, twisting slightly with each gust. Gunfire cracked from above. The sound was sharper now, closer, predatory. German fighters circled, surveying the crippled fortress like vultures. Gene's hands shook on the triggers. His arms throbbed with pain. Every movement sent jolts through shattered bones. Blood smeared his vision, turning the world into red-tinged chaos. From below, he could see the ball turret. Pee-wee's last words echoed faintly in his mind, but the turret was empty now. The realization struck him with cold finality. He was alone. Smoke and debris filled the tail. A shell had torn a hole through the fuselage, and every breath tasted of iron. The metallic groan of the plane was constant, like the voice of some living thing in agony. A Bf-109 dove toward him. He squeezed the triggers. The barrels rattled. Fire met fire. The Messerschmitt spun away, but another immediately replaced it, relentless. They never stopped. Gene's heart pounded louder than the engines. Every second stretched into an eternity. The Rikki Tikki Tavi shuddered under hits to the wings and fuselage. Sparks flew where metal scraped metal. The tail wobbled, then dipped, then righted itself. He could feel the air pulling at him, as if the sky itself wanted to rip him free. His mind raced. How do I survive this? The radio crackled weakly. No response. Silence. The rest of the crew were gone. Dead or captured. He didn't know. He didn't want to know. Gunfire tore through the air again. Gene fired back. Each burst a mixture of instinct and despair. He saw one fighter's nose explode in black smoke. For a moment, hope flickered. Then the Rikki Tikki Tavi groaned louder, warning him. The fortress had reached its limit. The engines were sputtering. The tail felt loose. Alone. The words sank deep into him. Alone in a sky filled with death, and there was nowhere to hide. The wind whipped past his ears. He could feel gravity tugging at him differently with each violent jolt. Above, the cloud line offered no salvation. Below, the earth seemed impossibly distant, yet impossibly near. Gene's fingers tightened on the triggers. Every shot, every movement was survival. Every second counted. Every second might be his last. A shadow flickered at the periphery, a German fighter again. He raised his guns. The fortress lurched violently under another hit, and the tail shivered as if it might tear away at any moment. Then came the eerie realization. He wasn't just fighting the Luftwaffe. He was fighting the sky itself. The endless blue had become a cage. For the first time, he whispered aloud, voice barely audible above the wind. I don't want to die here. The words hung in the air, swallowed by the roar of engines and the crack of gunfire. And somewhere deep inside, a stubborn spark of defiance flickered. He would survive. Somehow. He had to. The air smelled like fire and metal. The sky above northern France had turned into a graveyard of planes, burning fortresses and shattered wings, falling through the clouds like dying birds. And somewhere in that chaos, Eugene Moran, the tail gunner who refused to die, found himself still alive. Barely. The Rikki Tikki Tavi was no longer a bomber. It was wreckage held together by stubbornness and faith. The engines coughed. The fuselage groaned. Holes big enough to crawl through lined her sides. But she was still in the air. The air screamed with tracer fire. And then, through the smoke, a shadow approached. A Bf-109. Sleek, deadly, beautiful in its own terrible way. The German fighter glided closer, its engine a deep mechanical growl. Gene swung his guns toward it, what was left of them. But the pilot didn't fire. He didn't even raise his nose. Instead, the German leveled his plane alongside the ruined fortress, just out of Gene's line of fire. For a moment, time stopped. 2 men, 2 soldiers. Two beating hearts caught in the storm of history. Eugene stared through the cracked plexiglass of his turret. The German turned his head, eyes hidden behind his goggles. And then he made a gesture, slow, deliberate, unmistakable. He pointed at Eugene, then pointed down. Land. For a moment, Eugene didn't understand. Was it a trick? A taunt before the kill? But then he saw the pilot's expression. Calm, almost sorrowful. This wasn't mockery. It was mercy. In that silent exchange, high above a burning continent, something human flickered to life. Two enemies, who had spent hours trying to destroy each other, suddenly saw what war tried to erase. The man behind the uniform. For Eugene, that second felt like a lifetime. A chance, maybe his only one, to surrender to live. But then the illusion broke. The rattle of machine gun fire tore through the air. Someone, another gunner still alive on Rikki Tikki Tavi, had fired at the German. The spell shattered. The BF-109 rolled hard to the right, engines roaring, and was gone in an instant, leaving only smoke and silence. Eugene slumped against the side of his turret, his breath heavy, his arms broken, his heart hollow. He knew what that meant. The next wave would not offer mercy. And they didn't. Within seconds, the rest of the fighters closed in. They came not as hunters now, but as executioners. Dozens of them, streaking through the clouds like arrows of vengeance. The air erupted with gunfire. Bullets shredded the tail, ripping through aluminum and flesh. The smell of gunpowder and burning fuel filled Eugene's lungs. He tried to return fire, his hands shaking, his body screaming, but the guns jammed again. The handles refused to move. The belt had torn. He hit the side of the turret with his fist in desperation, pain flaring through his shattered bones. And still he fought. Still he tried. That's what it meant to be a tail gunner, to hold the line when everything else was falling apart. Then came the final barrage. A burst of rounds ripped across the fuselage, punching through the metal and into his body. One hit his shoulder. Another tore through his side. Then his ribs cracked under the force of impact. The pain was beyond words, beyond comprehension. And yet, Eugene didn't scream for help. He didn't cry for mercy. He just kept firing, half-conscious, bleeding, alone, until his guns went silent. In that last, terrible moment, as the Rikki Tikki Tavi burned and broke apart, Eugene Moran had become something beyond a soldier. He was the last defiant voice of a dying machine, a man who faced the devil in the sky and refused to bow. The next assault tore the Rikki Tikki Tavi apart. The tail section disintegrated under cannon fire. Eugene was thrown to the floor, blood pouring from his arms and chest. Both arms broken, several ribs shattered. Still, he tried to fight back. He managed to unjam one of his guns and fire a few desperate bursts before another volley hit him square in the chest. The fortress lurched, groaned, and began its final descent. Then came the sound every airman feared most. Metal tearing. The tail section broke away, and Eugene fell with it. The tail spun violently. Faster, faster, the G-forces pinning him in place, vision turning red. He could see nothing, only the endless fall. Then the crash. Trees splintered like matchsticks as the tail slammed into the forest. Against every law of nature, Eugene Moran survived. He crawled through wreckage and blood toward the faint light leaking through a jagged tear in the fuselage. He felt the softness of his skull where bone had split. But he was alive. On the forest floor, he looked up. The tail of the Rikki Tikki Tavi hung in the branches above him, his tomb suspended in the air. He laughed. He cried. He had fallen from the sky and lived. Hours later, voices echoed through the forest. French workers and German soldiers found him, a miracle wrapped in blood and metal. He was taken to a POW hospital, where a Serbian doctor operated on his exposed brain, fitting a metal plate to cover the wound. Eugene survived the unthinkable, but the war inside him never stopped. Nightmares of falling, screams, and darkness haunted him for years. When the war ended, Eugene was repatriated alongside one of the only other survivors, navigator Jesse Orson. The rest of the Rikki Tikki Tavi crew never came home. The forest is quiet now. The distant echoes of war have faded into memory. Eugene Moran sits in a small study, sunlight filtering through a dusty window. On the wall, photographs of his crew, black and white, faces frozen in time, remind him of brothers lost too soon. He rarely speaks of that day, the day the sky tore him from his friends and left him dangling between life and death. But when he does, his voice is quiet, almost reverent. Pee-wee, Donald, Jesse, he whispers, naming them as if calling their spirits home. When John Armbruster, the author who would later tell Gene's story in Tailspin, asked him about the fall, Gene paused, fingers tracing the edge of a photo of the Rikki Tikki Tavi's tail. I can still hear them, he said finally. The engines, the wind. Pee-wee laughing. It wasn't ghosts he spoke of. It was the echo of courage. The bond of men who had faced impossible odds together and had become more than soldiers. They had become family. Over the years, Gene's body bore the marks of that day. Metal plates in his skull, scars across his arms and chest. Yet his spirit carried something stronger, a quiet resilience, a reminder that survival could come in the most unimaginable ways. He watched generations grow. He saw the world change. Wars came and went, but the lessons of that frozen November sky never left him. Courage, sacrifice, and loyalty were not just words. They were lived in every heartbeat, every memory. Sometimes at night, he would close his eyes and feel the rush of wind, the weight of the tailgunner's seat, the roar of engines overhead. And he would smile, not because he was unscarred, not because he had forgotten, but because he had lived. Gene Moran never sought glory. He didn't need medals or fame. The true testament of his life was the story he carried quietly in his chest. The story of a young man who fell from the sky, survived the impossible, and lived to honor the brothers who never came home. In the hearts of those who hear it, his story becomes more than a tale of survival. It becomes proof. Courage outlasts fear, loyalty outlasts death, and the human spirit can endure even the fall from the sky. The camera pans to the last photograph of Gene, smiling softly, surrounded by his family. Outside the window, the wind stirs gently, carrying echoes of a sky once filled with fire and flak, now silent, except in memory.